This video is brought to you by Morning Brew. So what is Morning Brew? Well, it's your morning coffee, but it's also a free daily email that gives you the latest news from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. It's a 5-minute read every day and it will keep you right up to date with the latest from the business world. Now you might think, business news, pretty boring, obviously unless you're watching VisualPolitik, or if you're subscribed to Morning Brew. It's witty, it's conversational, it's even, dare I say it, it's pretty funny. Now I'm supposed to talk about how it fits into my morning routine, but by the time it arrives, because of my time zone, it's usually around lunch, but I do tend to read it while having my lunch, which is rather nice. So, click the link in the description below to subscribe to Morning Brew. Just do it, you'll enjoy it, and it's free. And let's get on with today's video. Delaware is the commercial capital of the United States. When we talk about business in America, Delaware is to the business world what Hollywood is to the film industry. It's the mecca of business. I'm sure that before watching this video, you probably thought that the economic epicenter of the United States would be in New York with the Wolves of Wall Street or in California with the guys from Silicon Valley. But no, American giants like Amazon, Coca-Cola, Facebook, Ford, General Electric, Google, all of these companies are registered in Wilmington, the largest city in the state of Delaware. So now you might be thinking, wow, with all of these companies, Wilmington must have a pretty impressive skyline, right? Well, no. In fact, if you dig a little deeper, you'll notice that all of these companies have the same address. It's always 1209 North Orange Street in Wilmington. So you might think, well, okay, perhaps Wilmington doesn't have an impressive skyline, but then this building at 1209 North Orange Street must be the mother of all skyscrapers. And it's on these occasions that you have to love Google for creating Street View. Why? Because the headquarters of more than 300,000 companies in the United States looks like this. I guess they must be pretty cozy in there. The fact is that those who think there's something sketchy going on here are kind of right. Those of you who work in finance are most likely aware of what's happening in Delaware, because if Delaware is famous for anything, it's for being a tax haven. But in this video, you'll see that Delaware is more than that. Delaware is symbolic of a way of doing business that may be on its last legs. So today's questions are, why is Delaware the commercial capital of the United States instead of the country's real economic epicenters? Why do we say that Delaware is a tax haven if they apply federal taxes like any other state in the US? Well, today we're going to answer these questions, but before we do, a bit of history.
More companies than people.
The United States is the 4th largest country on the planet and the 3rd most populous after China and India. Now, within the United States, what role does Delaware play? Because if you're not from the United States, the chances are you haven't heard of Delaware, and that's not really surprising. After all, it's the 2nd smallest state in the US. The island of Puerto Rico is actually bigger than Delaware. From one end to the other, this state measures less than 200 kilometers or 124 miles. And as for population, it barely has 1 million inhabitants, so in principle, Delaware would play the same role as Cyprus within the EU. So how has Delaware managed to attract companies to its territory? To understand this, we need to make one thing very clear. The United States is a federal state. It's made up of 50 individual states, and they all have very different laws. For example, if you live in Vermont and want to get a divorce, everyone advises you to go to New Hampshire, the neighboring state. Why? Let me explain. Imagine that I live in Montpelier, Vermont's capital. If I want to get a divorce, first lawyers will tell me that getting a divorce in Vermont will take at least a year. However, if I take my car and drive 124 miles southeast to Concord, New Hampshire's capital, I can get divorced the same day. But let's get back to Delaware. It all began at the end of the 19th century. Until then, it was normal for a company to register its commercial headquarters in the state in which it carried out its activity. However, New Jersey was the first state to notice a business niche. In New Jersey, they thought, if I attract companies that operate in other states, they'll pay the taxes that they are paying in other states to me. So they approved a series of tax advantages. And you can imagine what businessmen said. They said, all right, well, let's move to New Jersey. By 1900, New Jersey had been so successful that other states who had problems with their accounts copied their legislation. That way, territories such as Arizona or Maine tried to become new business paradises. Some states promised lower rates, others milder regulations, but the Delaware corporation law was the most successful scheme. Those who were critical of this competition between states called it a race to the bottom, a race towards the abyss. This idea became so ingrained that some states started withdrawing the advantages they had been offering companies to do business in their state. Even New Jersey did this, and they were the pioneer. Everyone stepped back. Everyone except for Delaware, who, as I said, became the mecca of business in 1913. Currently, more than 1 million companies are registered in Delaware, even though its population barely reaches 950,000. The key to its success has been maintaining an ideal climate for doing business, a legal framework that offers shareholders, entrepreneurs, and investors sufficient trust. It's a land of lawyers, economists, and everything revolves around corporate services. Delaware has earned the reputation of what they call the franchise. What for many is a tax haven, for Delaware, it's simply a way of making a living. Because at the end of the day, the taxes and the judicial fees that the commercial entities pay cover almost a third of the state's income. A century on, Delaware remains at the top. How do they do it? Well, let's take a look.
The franchise.
Every lawyer in the United States knows the laws of 2 states by heart, those of the state where he or she works and those of Delaware. I don't know about you, but to me, those kinds of things show why federalism makes sense. Just as Arizona has the Grand Canyon and attracts tourism, or Maine has developed a paper or fishing industry, Delaware has developed its economy by catering to companies. Of course, at this point, you might be wondering, what's the magic tax advantage that Delaware offers? Well, in the United States, companies pay federal and local taxes. The federal corporate tax rate is 21% and affects Delaware just like any other state. And then there's a state tax of almost 9%. The thing is that there's a type of business partnership, the so-called LLC, which in Delaware allows companies to be exempt from the 9% state tax. That is, if they don't develop their activity within the state.
64% of Fortune 500 firms are Delaware corporations.
A good fiscal strategy can reduce taxes by 10 to 40%. Those who know about the matter estimate that other states can lose out on between $6.5 and $9.5 billion due to what they call the Delaware loophole. Here's an example to illustrate better. Toys R Us, those enormous toy stores that Jeff Bezos squashed when he created Amazon, had a pet, Jeffrey Giraffe. Toys R Us created a company in Delaware called Jeffrey LLC, to which it transferred the image rights of Jeffrey the Giraffe. As a result, all the Toys R Us branches around the world send a good chunk of their profits to that subsidiary in Delaware as payment for using Jeffrey Giraffe as a commercial claim in their stores. That way they got 2 things. One, all the money that was sent to Delaware was exempt from the state corporate tax in the states where the stores were actually located. And 2, by noting the payments of image rights as an expense in their accounts, Toys R Us stores artificially decreased their profit, and so the tax agents had no way to get their hands on that money. As payment for operating in Delaware and benefiting from these advantages, the state charges its companies the franchise tax. This is an annual tax that depends on the size of the company. This franchise tax ranges from $175 and $250 paid by smaller companies to $200,000 paid by large corporations. But what companies like most about working in Delaware is that there are no nasty surprises from the courts. The Chancery Court, the special court that addresses business issues, and the Delaware Supreme Court play a decisive role in this. They have experienced judges who work with legislation and jurisprudence that is very favorable for business. What do I mean? Well, for example, their judges don't really like it when shareholders present lawsuits. That is, when a company's shareholders don't agree with the board of directors' management, one of their options is to turn to justice and defend their interests. But I can explain this better with a recent example.
Delaware court refuses to revive Uber shareholder lawsuit.
Let me give you a quick summary. In 2016, Uber's board of directors decided to invest almost $700 million in a startup founded by a former Google engineer. The goal was to develop an autonomous car. It looks like neither Travis Kalanick, Uber's co-founder, nor anyone on the board of directors considered the possibility that Google may not like this, and so it didn't take long for them to get a lawsuit from Google for intellectual property theft over Waymo's technology. In a nutshell, this blip cost Uber $245 million. Thus, a shareholder decided to sue the Uber board for its management. And do you know how the Delaware Supreme Court responded? That he could present a claim if he had complained to the Uber board of directors at the outset. That is, when they decided to invest in the startup, but not now that the investment had failed. Makes a lot of sense, right? Now, I don't want you to think that they always rule in favor of the companies. Facebook learnt this the hard way from the Cambridge Analytica case.
Facebook loses court battle to keep internal privacy breach records private.
Another interesting thing for companies is what happens with takeover bids. Delaware law has changed because it used to offer too many incentives for shareholders to refuse to sell their shares and to file lawsuits if a takeover bid was successful. They always won. If they were right and the price offered in the takeover bid was low, then the buying company had to pay a price set by a judge. And if they weren't correct, they still received the price set for the takeover bid and were only charged 5% interest on the funds they held during the judicial process. With the latest legislative changes, interest is no longer charged, and if the shareholder isn't right when he or she makes a claim, they will most likely receive a lower price than the one originally offered for the takeover. So filing lawsuits is no longer safe for shareholders and contains some new risks. But not everything is humming in Delaware. Want to hear about their biggest risk? Well, listen up.
Ghost capitalism.
Registering a company in Delaware is very easy. They ask for less information than when you register a library card. That's why corporate secrecy is also a big factor in Delaware's success. Any lawyer can be hired to handle the paperwork, and there's no obligation to state who the company's real owners are. In other words, Delaware is an ideal place from which to operate ghost companies. The lack of transparency could be compared to the banking secrecy of countries like Liechtenstein or Switzerland, which was tolerated by these countries until a few years back. Bank secrecy was born with good intentions. It was a way to set firewalls to protect some fortunes from the thirst for funds that had been generated by the devastating wars in the first half of the 20th century. The problem is that when you allow corporate secrecy to exist, you're opening a door through which those who want their dark activities to stay in the dark try to sneak in. I'm talking about corrupt politicians, terrorists, arms dealers, and drug traffickers who hide their identities by creating these ghost companies while they look for ways to launder money. After decades of failure in the fight against organized crime, it looks like things began to change 4 years ago. The United Kingdom promised to hold public records on the real ownership of its companies, and since then, some of the world's largest offshore centers have increased their corporate transparency on property, having created targets for 2023.
Jersey, Guernsey, and Isle of Man to set up public registers of firms' owners.
In the United States, they have also started working on this. It isn't the first time that federal bodies have tried to end Delaware's corporate secrecy, but it is the first time that it has successfully advanced to Congress. We're talking about the Corporate Transparency Act, which will be examined by the Senate in 2020. The goal is to require companies to disclose their real beneficiaries to the Financial Crime Compliance Network, a federal agency, and to keep their property information up to date. This measure would end the business secrecy of states like Delaware and Nevada and stop money laundering. The good news is that it looks like both parties are already aware that corporate secrecy seriously harms the fight against financial crimes. The bad news is that up until now, it also seems that both major political parties were all too familiar with the advantages of corporate secrecy. The Clintons knew it as they charged more than $200,000 for each of their conferences. And you know how they channeled that money? Through LLC companies registered in Delaware. But the Clintons aren't the only ones. This guy did it too.
You know, we do a lot of business in Delaware. That's good because that means taxes and everything. So I said, how many entities do we have registered in Delaware, like companies and this? So I figured they'd say maybe 2 or 3, right? 378. I said, what? So we have 378 entities registered in the state of Delaware, meaning I pay you a lot of money, folks. I don't feel at all guilty, okay?
Of course, if the corporate transparency law is passed, we'd be facing the most significant regulatory change in the field for the last 50 years. We'll be keeping an eye on what happens next, but in the meantime, here's a question for you. What do you think of Delaware? Do you think you'd register a company there, or do you think its fiscal competitiveness harms the entire United States? You can leave your answer in the comments below. Meanwhile, don't forget that we release new videos every week, so please do subscribe to this channel and you won't miss any updates. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.